Like, when does it all start? Do they come to you with a shoe, a bunch of shoes? Do you kind of get to tweak them here and there? How is that process?
Yeah, I think it's honestly been like probably one of the coolest things I've got to do since, honestly, the process started at the end of my senior year when I was at Iowa, because I was deciding what shoe company I was going to go with. And I talked to Nike, Adidas, and Under Armour, and they all offered me a signature shoe, obviously some faster than others. And
there are moments in sports that stop you cold. Not because of a buzzer beater, not because of a championship trophy being hoisted, but because someone in the middle of their own historic rise decides to do something so unexpectedly generous, so quietly powerful, that it completely reframes everything you thought you knew about them. Caitlin Clark just had one of those moments, and the shockwave it sent through Nike's corporate offices, through the WNBA front office, and straight through the internet is still being felt right now. Critics spent months building a very specific story about Clark. They said the pressure would crack her. They said the spotlight would make her selfish. They said the resentment from her peers would eventually leave her isolated, standing alone at the top of a league that never fully welcomed her. Every single one of those people is scrambling right now, because what Clark just pulled off didn't just silence her doubters, it rewrote the rulebook on what athlete power and loyalty can actually look like in women's sports. And the number attached to it, $1.9 million in 4 hours, is the kind of figure that makes corporate boardrooms break into a cold sweat. This isn't just a story about sneakers. This is a story about power, protection, and what happens when the most famous woman in basketball decides to use every ounce of her leverage for someone else. Stick with us, because by the time we're done, you'll understand exactly why the WNBA will never operate the same way again. To understand why this moment hits so differently, you have to understand what Caitlin Clark walked into when she entered the WNBA. This wasn't a normal rookie arrival. This was a cultural earthquake. Clark had broken the all-time NCAA scoring record, shattered television ratings, and turned college basketball into must-watch television for millions of people who had never given the sport a second look. She didn't just enter the WNBA as a promising young player, she entered as a phenomenon. And phenomena in professional sports always come with a price. The scrutiny she faced from the moment she stepped onto a professional court was unlike anything any women's basketball player had ever dealt with. Every move was analyzed, every missed shot was amplified, every awkward interaction with a veteran player was dissected across social media for days. The media narrative machine was working overtime, and a significant part of it was pushing one very clear story. Caitlin Clark was a problem. She was too famous, too hyped, too much. The suggestion was always lurking just beneath the surface that she hadn't earned her place, that her fame was a product of marketing rather than merit, and that the real players in the league privately resented every second of attention she was receiving. And if you paid close enough attention, some of that resentment wasn't entirely hidden. There were physical incidents on the court that raised eyebrows, hard fouls that went beyond competitive basketball. Moments where the line between tough defense and something more personal seemed dangerously thin. The league took notice, fans took notice, and for a while, it genuinely seemed like the narrative the critics were pushing might have some truth to it, that Clark was navigating a league that was, at least in some corners, working against her. But here's what the critics missed entirely. They were so focused on trying to isolate Clark that they completely failed to see the coalition forming around her. And at the center of that coalition was a player whose name, at the time, most casual fans couldn't even tell you. A player who had decided, loudly and without apology, that she was going to make it her personal mission to protect the most famous woman in the sport. Sophie Cunningham is not a household name in the way that Caitlin Clark is. She doesn't have the college legacy, the national television moments, or the endorsement portfolio that Clark has built. But inside the WNBA, Sophie Cunningham has a reputation that commands a very different kind of respect. She is physical, she is fearless, and she has absolutely zero patience for what she views as cheap shots against her teammates. When Clark started taking hard contact during games, the kind that drew loud reactions from fans and heated debates online, most players stayed quiet. That's the unwritten code in professional sports. You don't publicly escalate. You don't make yourself the story. You keep your head down and let the league handle it. Sophie Cunningham looked at that unwritten code, made direct eye contact with it, and threw it straight out the window.
She stepped up verbally, she stepped up physically on the court. She made it unmistakably clear to anyone willing to test Caitlin Clark that there would be consequences. Not subtle ones, not diplomatic ones. Real, immediate, in-your-face consequences from a player who had spent years building the kind of toughness that doesn't come from highlight reels. It came from being the player nobody built marketing campaigns around. The player who showed up every night and did the hard, unglamorous, essential work that winning teams require. What made Cunningham's loyalty so striking wasn't just that she defended Clark, it was how openly she did it. In a league environment where the politically safe move was to stay neutral, stay quiet, and avoid the appearance of taking sides in what had become a genuinely charged cultural debate, Sophie Cunningham planted her flag without hesitation. She wasn't doing it for cameras. She wasn't doing it for a contract. She was doing it because by every account, that's simply who she is. And Caitlin Clark was paying very close attention. In professional sports, loyalty is the rarest currency in the game. Players are traded, contracts are restructured, rosters are flipped overnight by executives who see athletes as assets rather than people. The relationships that survive that environment, the ones built on something more than circumstance, are the ones that actually mean something. Clark and Cunningham built that kind of relationship in real time in front of an audience of millions during one of the most intense media spotlights women's basketball has ever generated. So, when Nike came calling with the kind of offer that changes a player's life forever, Caitlin Clark walked into that boardroom with something on her mind that nobody in that room saw coming. The Nike signature shoe deal for Caitlin Clark was, by any measure, a landmark moment in women's sports history. Signature shoe deals are rare in the WNBA. The list of players who have earned one is short, exclusive, and historically dominated by the sport's absolute elite. When Clark secured her deal, it sent a message to the entire industry about where women's basketball was headed and how seriously the biggest brand in sports was willing to invest in its future. From a purely business standpoint, the play was obvious. Build the campaign around Clark. Put her face on everything. Leverage her massive crossover appeal to move product in markets that women's basketball had never penetrated before. She was the face, the story, the engine. Every marketing instinct in that room pointed in exactly one direction. But Caitlin Clark, according to reports, walked in with a different idea entirely. The details of what exactly was said in those negotiations are still being pieced together, and it's worth being clear that the full specifics remain unverified. But what has been widely reported and discussed is that Clark made a significant push to ensure that Sophie Cunningham was incorporated into her Nike campaign in a real, meaningful, financially impactful way. Not as a background figure, not as a supporting mention in a press release, as an actual featured presence in the marketing with the kind of visibility and economic benefit that comes from being part of a signature campaign at that level. Think about what that means for a second. A rookie, even as famous as Clark, walking into a negotiation with one of the most powerful corporations on the planet and using her leverage not to extract more money for herself, but to demand that her teammate gets a seat at the table. Nike executives, by most accounts of the story, were caught completely flat-footed. This simply isn't how these deals work. Superstars negotiate for themselves. They build their own empires. The idea of a player in the middle of securing a career-defining deal stopping to say, "And I want you to take care of the person who had my back," that's not in any standard playbook. It was either the most calculated power move in modern sports marketing history, or it was simply the most genuine expression Clark could think to make. Either way, the result was the same. When the campaign officially launched, featuring both Clark and Cunningham in a way that went far beyond a standard endorsement rollout, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Fans who had spent months watching Cunningham defend Clark with fierce, uncompromising loyalty saw this as the moment the loyalty got rewarded. They didn't just respond to it, they mobilized around it.
The online conversation shifted almost instantly. What had been a space filled with debates about Clark's place in the league, about resentment and division and complicated dynamics, suddenly became something different. It became a celebration. Fans who had watched Cunningham step up again and again while the cameras focused elsewhere finally had a moment to channel all of that appreciation into something tangible. They bought shoes, a lot of shoes. Within hours of the campaign going live, reports began circulating about the volume of traffic hitting the retail platforms. Servers were struggling, wait times were climbing. The kind of technical chaos that usually accompanies a limited edition drop from a male superstar with decades of cultural cachet was happening in real time for a WNBA-connected campaign. By the 4-hour mark, the reported sales figure being circulated was staggering, $1.9 million. Now, it's worth noting that the precise breakdown of those numbers and exactly how they're being attributed is still being discussed and scrutinized in various corners of the sports media world. But the broad consensus that this launch generated extraordinary numbers by any standard for women's sports merchandise is not seriously in dispute. The retail response was real, the cultural moment was real, and the implications of both were immediately felt by people who had spent years betting against exactly this kind of outcome. The servers crashing wasn't just a technical inconvenience, it was a symbol. It was proof, delivered in the most concrete possible way, that the audience Clark has built isn't just watching, they're investing, they're spending. They're showing up with their wallets open in numbers that the SMI industry had not associated with women's basketball before Clark arrived. And crucially, that energy, that economic force, wasn't locked around Clark alone. It transferred. Immediately and dramatically, it transferred to Sophie Cunningham, who went from being a respected but relatively unknown veteran to someone whose name was being searched, whose profile was being followed, and whose brand value had quite literally changed overnight. There's a particular kind of silence that falls over a room when the argument you've been making in loud, confident terms gets completely demolished in public. Not the silence of thoughtful reconsideration, the silence of people trying to figure out how quickly they can reposition themselves without anyone noticing the pivot. That's the silence that fell over Caitlin Clark's most vocal critics in the days following this launch. For months, the narrative being pushed from certain corners of the sports media landscape was built on a simple premise. Clark was dividing the WNBA. Her presence was creating friction. Her fame was a source of tension that would ultimately damage the league rather than elevate it. The subtext was always clear. The existing players were the real story, the real talent, and Clark was an interloper whose celebrity was built on hype rather than substance. This launch didn't just challenge that narrative, it obliterated it from multiple directions simultaneously. First, it demonstrated that Clark's loyalty to her teammates was not just genuine, but active and financially real. She hadn't just said nice things about Cunningham in press conferences. She had reportedly gone into a corporate negotiation and demanded that her teammate benefit directly from her success. That's not the behavior of someone who views her peers as competition to be outmaneuvered. That's the behavior of someone who understands that real power, lasting power, is built through relationships rather than isolation. Second, and perhaps more importantly from a purely economic standpoint, it proved that Clark's commercial appeal is a rising tide rather than a zero-sum game. The critics had framed her fame as something that was taking up space that belonged to other players, that every camera pointed at Clark was a camera pointed away from someone more deserving. But the numbers from this launch told a completely different story. When Clark elevated Cunningham into her spotlight, Cunningham's visibility didn't cannibalize Clark's, it multiplied. Both players came out of that 4-hour window with more cultural presence, more commercial value, and more fan loyalty than they had going in. That's the argument that no amount of media spin can counter. Not hot takes, not social media outrage cycles, not carefully constructed narratives about resentment and division.
cold, hard sales numbers that speak for themselves in the language that corporate boardrooms understand better than any other.
The sports marketing industry has operated on a set of assumptions for decades. Individual stars build individual brands. Companies identify the most marketable faces, attach them to products, and sell the image of singular greatness. The entire machinery is built around the idea of the lone icon, the one transcendent figure whose image moves product in a way that no team dynamic or collective story ever could. Caitlin Clark just punched a significant hole in that model. What she demonstrated, intentionally or not, is that the most powerful marketing story in modern sports might not be the lone superstar. It might be the superstar who uses her power to lift others. Because what fans responded to so viscerally in this moment wasn't just a product, it was a narrative. It was the story of a woman at the peak of her earning power choosing loyalty over accumulation, choosing to share a platform that every corporate instinct told her to protect exclusively for herself. That story sells, not in the cynical, manufactured way that PR teams try to package athlete goodwill stories. It sells because people can feel the difference between something authentic and something staged. And the relationship between Clark and Cunningham, forged through real moments, real defense, real conflict, real loyalty, reads as authentic in a way that no marketing campaign could manufacture if it tried. The executives who had built their entire WNBA strategy around controlling the Clark narrative, around managing her image as a solo act, are now watching something they didn't design and can't fully control, generating results that exceed anything they projected. That's an uncomfortable position for people who are used to being the ones who decide how stories get told. And the lesson they're being forced to absorb is one that Caitlin Clark apparently understood intuitively. In the current media landscape, authenticity isn't just a nice quality to have, it's the most commercially powerful asset in the game. Here's where things get genuinely interesting, because the Clark-Cunningham Nike moment isn't just a feel-good story about teammates with a heartwarming loyalty that happened to generate impressive sales numbers. It's a signal. A very specific, very loud signal about where the power dynamics in women's sports are headed and what that means for the athletes, the leagues, the brands, and the fans who've been watching this transformation unfold in real time. For years, the conversation around women's sports and corporate investment has been frustratingly circular. Brands would say they weren't investing heavily because the audience wasn't there. Critics would point out that the audience wasn't growing because the investment wasn't there. The chicken and egg argument went in circles while the athletes themselves continued to be dramatically underpaid relative to the market value they were generating. Caitlin Clark's arrival in the WNBA cracked that cycle open in a way that nothing else had managed to do. The ratings numbers she generated were impossible to argue with. The attendance figures were impossible to ignore. The merchandise demand was impossible to dismiss. For the first time in a very long time, the conversation shifted because the evidence was simply too overwhelming to spin in any other direction. But here's what the Clark-Cunningham Nike moment adds to that story. It's not just that Clark is commercially powerful. It's that her commercial power is contagious. It transfers. When she decides to point her platform at a teammate, that teammate becomes commercially significant almost overnight. That's a kind of economic leverage that no single athlete in women's basketball history has ever wielded in quite this way. Think about what that means going forward. What happens when Clark decides to spotlight another teammate? What happens when other WNBA stars, inspired by this model, begin using their own platforms and endorsement leverage to demand inclusion for their peers? What happens when corporate sponsors realize that the most effective way to tap into the passionate, loyal, economically active audience that Clark has built isn't to compete with her, but to align with the players she vouches for? The ripple effects of this single moment extend far beyond one shoe launch, far beyond one 4-hour sales window, far beyond Sophie Cunningham's individual career trajectory.
They point toward a fundamentally different model of how superstardom functions in women's sports. One where the rising tide actually does lift all boats, not just as a platitude, but as a demonstrable, measurable commercial reality.
It would be easy to get so caught up in the macro significance of this moment that we lose sight of what it means on a purely human level for Sophie Cunningham specifically. So let's take a moment to sit with that. Cunningham has spent her professional career doing the work that winning requires and receiving very little of the recognition that comes with it. She's been the player coaches rely on for toughness, for intensity, for the willingness to take on physically demanding assignments that more celebrated players step back from. She's been valuable in the way that role players are always valuable, essential to the teams that have her, invisible to the broader public that only pays attention to the names on the marquee. That invisibility has real consequences in professional sports. It affects endorsement income. It affects media presence. It affects the kinds of opportunities that open up during a career, and perhaps more importantly, after one ends. Players who spend their careers in supporting roles, no matter how brilliantly they execute those roles, typically exit the sport without the platform or financial foundation of the stars they played alongside. Cunningham's association with Clark had already shifted that equation somewhat, simply through the exposure that comes from being regularly visible alongside the most watched player in women's basketball. But what this Nike moment did was something categorically different. It didn't just give Cunningham visibility, it gave her a story, a specific, emotionally resonant, commercially backed story about loyalty and reward that the public immediately connected with. Her social media following grew at rates that typically accompany viral moments rather than steady career building. Her name entered conversations that a week earlier wouldn't have included her. Her market value, the number that determines what brands are willing to pay for her association with their products, shifted in ways that will have concrete, lasting effects on her financial life. And none of it happened because of anything Cunningham did in this particular moment. It happened because of what she had already done, consistently and without expectation of this specific reward over the months prior. She protected someone. She showed up. She made it personal in a situation where staying neutral would have been far easier and far safer professionally. The return she received for that is a reminder that in the long game of professional sports, where careers end suddenly and unexpectedly, where windows of opportunity open and close with brutal speed, genuine loyalty, extended without calculation, has a way of paying dividends that no spreadsheet could have projected. Here's the thing about moments that rewrite rules. The people who were comfortable under the old rules never fully accept the change immediately. There's always a lag. There's always a period where the old guard insists that what just happened is an anomaly, a one-time alignment of unusual circumstances that shouldn't be taken as evidence of any broader shift. You can already hear that argument being assembled in various corners of the sports media world. The suggestion that Clark's commercial power is a unique, unrepeatable phenomenon, rather than a blueprint that other athletes could follow. The implication that the $1.9 million figure is a product of Clark's specific celebrity and has nothing to do with the collaborative model she and Cunningham demonstrated. The quiet insistence that the old rules still apply and that the league's power brokers will ultimately reassert control over how these stories get told and how these dollars get distributed. What that argument misses, what it always misses, is that once fans have seen a model that resonates with them this deeply, they don't forget it. They don't go back to accepting less. The audience that showed up for this Nike launch wasn't just buying shoes, they were voting for a vision of what women's sports could look like, where superstars share their platforms, where loyalty gets rewarded in concrete and public ways, where the most powerful players in the game use that power to elevate rather than accumulate. That audience will be back, and they'll be watching to see whether the players, the brands, and the league itself learned the right lesson from what just happened. The brands that figure it out first, that understand the commercial power of authentic collaboration in this space, will have an enormous advantage over the ones still clinging to the lone superstar model that Clark just demonstrated has a serious ceiling.
The players who follow Clark's lead, who look at their own platforms, their own endorsement leverage, their own moments of commercial power, and ask how they can use them to bring others along, will build the kind of loyal audiences that sustain careers and create legacies. The ones who don't will be chasing a model that's already showing its age. And the WNBA itself faces perhaps the most consequential choice of all. The league can either lean into the collaborative, loyalty-driven culture that this moment represents and build a structural environment that rewards it and amplifies it, or it can continue operating according to the traditional gatekeeping instincts that have defined professional sports leagues for decades, controlling narratives, managing stars, protecting established hierarchies. One of those paths leads toward a league that looks like what Caitlin Clark and Sophie Cunningham just sketched out in 4 historic hours. The other leads toward the same ceiling women's basketball has been bumping against for years. When the history of this era in women's basketball gets written, the Caitlin Clark chapter will obviously be central to it. The record-breaking, the ratings surge, the cultural crossover moment that finally forced the broader sports world to take women's basketball seriously in the way its players and fans always knew it deserved, all of that will be in the record. But here's what I think will stand out most clearly when people look back at this specific moment: the Nike launch, the Sophie Cunningham inclusion, the $1.9 million in 4 hours. It will be remembered as the first time a player at Clark's level used the full weight of her commercial power not to build her own empire, but to demonstrate what a shared one could look like. In a sports landscape dominated by stories of individual ambition, contract disputes, locker room divisions, and the grinding machinery of corporate sports entertainment, that's a genuinely rare thing. It's the kind of move that cuts through the noise, not because it's calculated to do so, but because it's real, because it reflects something people recognize instinctively and immediately as the way things should work, even when they're not used to seeing it actually happen. Caitlin Clark is still at the very beginning of what will almost certainly be a long and historic professional career. Sophie Cunningham has years of playing in front of her. The Nike deal is a chapter, not a conclusion. The $1.9 million is a data point in a story that's still being written. But the precedent that got set in those 4 hours, the idea that superstardom in women's sports doesn't have to mean solitude, that loyalty can be the strategy rather than just the sentiment, that the most powerful move a franchise player can make might be to use her leverage for someone else, that precedent is not going away. The executives in the boardrooms are taking notes. The other players in the league are watching. The fans who made those servers crash are waiting to see what comes next. And Caitlin Clark, if the story of this moment tells us anything at all, is already thinking about the move after this one. The revolution isn't coming, it's already here. And it started in a boardroom where a rookie looked across the table at some of the most powerful people in sports marketing and said, "My teammate comes with me." That's the kind of story that doesn't end at $1.9 million. That's the kind of story that's just getting started. If this video opened your eyes to what's really happening inside the WNBA's power structure, smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell, because what's coming next in this league is going to move even faster than anyone expects, and you don't want to be the last one to see it.